Good afternoon, everyone. I'm
Shalom,
Professor
shalom.
Nancy Horowitz. I am the director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. This series has been, the Rabin series has been a very important event for the Elie Wiesel Center. It helps us to educate and inspire a wider audience beyond Boston University. And welcome to those of you who are participating in Zoom. Yitzhak Rabin was a visionary leader who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1994 for his dedicated efforts to make peace between Israel and its neighbors. His legacy continues, and we honor that legacy by bringing major speakers to the university who address issues of peace and human rights. The series was initiated by John Krivine, who is here with us. John, could you please stand up? I'm now going to embarrass him. John felt very strongly that the center should hold a biannual lecture in Rabin's honor in order to honor his memory. I also want to thank the committee that put this program together. Abby Gilman, who you will hear from in a little while, who's here, Matt Creighton, and Pnina Lahav herself, as well as our administrator, Teresa Cooney, without whom none of these programs would be possible. We now have a special video welcome from Dalia Rabin, who was Yitzhak's daughter.
Hi, dear community of Jews in Boston, and welcome to the Rabin yearly lecture. I would like to tell you about what's happening a little bit in Israel. Probably you all know and you read, and you are concerned like us about the reform Minister of Justice of this new government that are trying to weaken Israel democracy, if not to just abolish it. And I hope you are aware of the tremendous rise up of the people from all the political men, from right to left, that are demonstrating every Saturday night and every other day all over the country against this reform, who means to take the control over the High Court of Justice, over the nominations of all justices in all the courts, and to put an end to the checks and balances. We don't have a constitution like you have, and to leave the power of nomination, all the justices in the political arena, means dictatorship. And this is what we are facing right now, and this is not Rabin vision. My father was a big believer in the democratic values. He always talked about establishing and fighting for Jewish democratic state, where everybody respects other people's beliefs and traditions and way of living. No coercion, no imposition, democracy. And this is what we are doing in our center. We try to convince the youngsters that are visiting our museum that always stick to democratic values, always try to have negotiations, to have dialogue, to believe in each other and to try to understand each other. And I hope you join us in our belief that democracy will prevail in Israel and will stay a steady and good friend and ally of the United States.
Thank you, Dalia Rabin. I would just say that when I think of Israel and the turbulence in Israel today, in these past few weeks, 3 words from the Psalms resound in my mind. Sha'alu Shlom Yerushalayim. can hear the alliteration. Pray for the well-being of Jerusalem. We pray for the restoration of well-being and peace in the land of Israel. My name is Abigail Gilman, and I am a professor in the Department of World Languages and Literatures. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, our respondent, and the moderator of the discussion, which will follow our lecture this evening. First of all, it is my great pleasure to introduce Pnina Lahav, Professor of Law Emerita, and very much treasured colleague in the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies. During the course of her legal career, Pnina Lahav has published nearly 50 articles and 3 books. Among them, the award-winning book of 1997, Judgment in Jerusalem, Chief Justice Shimon Agranat and the Zionist Century. She has held prestigious research fellowships from the Rockefeller Foundation, Stanford University, and Hebrew University. In the law school, Professor Lahav has taught constitutional law, First Amendment law, and also a course on comparative American and Israeli law. She was awarded a teaching prize in the law school, the BU Law Melton Prize for Excellence in Teaching in 2011. In 2017, she won an award for excellence in scholarship. That is the Life Achievement Award in Israel Studies by the Israel Studies Institute and Association for Israel Studies. And in 2021, she won the Prime Minister Golda Meir Award for Society and Leadership. This evening, she will be speaking about her recent book titled The Only Woman in the Room, Golda Meir and Her Path to Power, Princeton University Press, 2022. And I think Pnina knows best how long I've been looking forward to this event tonight. Our respondent this evening is Professor Batsheva Margalit Stern, a historian of 20th century Jewish women and women in Zionism. Professor Stern teaches women's studies and Jewish history at the Schechter Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem. She recently co-edited a special issue of the journal called Israel Studies, titled New Perspectives on Women in Israeli Society. She's the author of 2 prize-winning books. One is on the women workers movement in Eretz Yisrael, and recently a biography titled The Revolutionary Ada Fishman Maimon. And Maimon is someone I learned about from reading Pnina's book, and Pnina has a copy of the biography of Ada Maimon, Mahapchanit. That's amazing. And as a result, in part of Professor Stern's research, she noted that new attention was drawn to this important revolutionary, leading to a new stamp created in Israel on the 50 years of her passing, just this past year. And our moderator this evening is our colleague Nachum Karlinsky, visiting professor at the Elie Wiesel Center and a senior lecturer at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism. Professor Karlinsky's scholarship studies the social, cultural, urban, and economic history of modern Israel-Palestine. He also has written on Jewish philanthropy, Hasidism, Jewish fundamentalism, and modern Jewish historiography. And his most recent book, which we had featured in our book talk series a couple of years back over Zoom, is called The Lost Orchard, the Palestinian Arab Citrus Industry, 1850 to 1950, which he co-authored with Mustafa Kaba. And with that, I turn the podium over to Pnina Lahav.
Thank you very much. Great pleasure to be here. I'm very fond of the center, as you all know, the Elie Wiesel Center. I wish to begin by thanking the leadership of the Elie Wiesel Center for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Nancy Horowitz, the director of the center, Michael Zank, the previous director of the center, Abby Gilman, who cooked the entire dish here today, and Matt Creighton, who was her sous chef, I believe. So thank you all. I also want to thank Jonathan Krivin for endowing the lecture and pushing us behind the scenes to do the right thing. That makes a difference. And it feels good to know that people care. So you should know that too. I also want to thank Teresa Cooney. Where is Teresa? I don't know. She's someplace making sure that everything works right. So this is my little obsession with the only woman in the room. She is not always visible, Teresa Cooney, but she's the life behind, yeah, always. She, no, but יש לי גם את התה הזה כאן, הייתי רוצה אותו בחזרה. תודה. סליחה. Teresa Cooney is the life behind the center. She makes sure that things work out. If you write to her, she will always make sure that what you ask for happens efficiently and promptly. And I have a great admiration for her and thank her here for her assistance. Also thanks to Dalia Rabin, of course, Dalia Rabin, and to our guests here, Batsheva Margalit Stern, who wrote this beautiful book about Ada Fishman Maimon. This is now in my bag. So I can show it to you. And to Professor Nahum Karlinsky, who taught me a great deal about Israeli history, and also I should add, helped me when I wrote my book. He looked over the book, he read it, gave me comments, etc., and I benefited a great deal. So thank you to all of you for helping me. And now to my talk. In an interview with the legendary Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci, Golda said, and I quote, "When a woman doesn't want only to give birth, to raise children, when a woman also wants to work, to be somebody, well, it's hard, hard, hard. I know it from personal experience," end of quote. Hard, 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 with a capital H in the middle, hard, hard, hard. Golda experienced the woman's life is hard. The stereotypical and traditional roles of the woman, already flagged in Genesis, to bear and raise children, were in conflict with the modern, non-traditional female role, a career outside the home, and clashed with women's ambition, the ambition to pursue social and political goals. In Golda's word, to be somebody. In the quotation from the Fallaci interview, Golda was saying that struggling with a family work tension accompanied her throughout her life, and that she experienced it as hard, hard, hard. At the same time, for me, the project of writing Golda's life was also hard. What was so hard for her, and what was so hard for me? Let me first give you a short synopsis of Golda's life before I go forward to discuss these hardships. I know that many of you know about Golda's life, but I'm sure not all of you do. Golda was born at the end of the 19th century in Kiev, Ukraine. Her father was a carpenter, mostly unemployed, and her mother undertook any job, from breastfeeding to baking to doing other people's laundry in order to support the family. The children and the adults knew cold, hunger, and fear of pogroms. As a teenager, Golda wished to pursue a teaching career, like many young girls, but her parents objected. Intense struggles at the home made Golda miserable. Men don't like smart girls, her father kept proclaiming, while her mother repeatedly yelled at her, "Why do you need this education for?" At the age of 14, Golda ran away from home to Denver, Colorado, where her sister Shana lived. Two important events followed. Golda was exposed to Shana's friends, all self-educated Jewish immigrants who enjoyed arguing about politics and political theory. And Golda met a guy, Maurice Meyerson. Golda realized slowly that her mission and vocation was in politics. Meeting Maurice Meyerson, the second event, ended with Golda's marriage to Maurice. That was not such a good marriage, but it ended, it yielded 2 children. Maurice was a voracious reader, lover of music and the arts, and perhaps most importantly, gentle, unlike her father and mother. They got married when Golda was 20 years old. By then, she already had strong political views, considered socialism the right way to run a society, and abandoned religion. Then, after a while, Golda, after getting married, Golda made Maurice make a commitment to go to Palestine. And indeed, they did travel to Palestine and settled in a kibbutz Merchavia for a few years. In Palestine, Golda plunged herself into the political world of the Labour Party. Her fluency in the English language, her Midwestern accent, and her rhetorical skills made her very attractive to the party bosses, and she rapidly rose up the political ladder, becoming a party boss herself. When the first Israeli cabinet was convened, we see Golda as the only woman among male ministers, holding the important position of Minister of Labor. She was also put in charge of the absorption of the more than 1 million immigrants who were pouring into the country in the early 50s. She stayed in this position of Minister of Labor until 1956 and called this period the best time of her life. Her achievements during that period were substantial. She led the Knesset to pass the Social Security Act that provides all members of Israeli society, Jews and Arabs, with a basic income regardless of age and medical hardships. She led the Knesset to pass a statute that would guarantee the rights of the working woman, including the right to maternity leave, a right that I should remind everybody is not yet recognized in American law. And then when Israel contemplated the Sinai or Suez War, Ben-Gurion moved her to the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs. This was a mighty promotion, as the Minister of Foreign Affairs is generally considered second to the Prime Minister in power and prestige. She remained in this role until 1964. When Prime Minister Levi Eshkol died of a heart attack in 1969, the party leadership invited Golda to succeed. Thus, at the age of 70, Golda became the 4th Prime Minister of Israel. But by that time, Golda enjoyed enormous popularity. She is the only woman, note, to have served in the position of Prime Minister in Israel. Take it to heart, the only woman. But the Israeli approval of Golda was short-lived. On Yom Kippur in October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a simultaneous attack on Israel. That war, one of the most traumatic in Israeli history, changed the Israeli public perception of Golda. People blamed her for the failure of the military intelligence to warn that war was on the horizon, for the unpreparedness of the army, and for her failure to heed the American efforts at reaching a compromise with Anwar el-Sadat, Egypt's president. Golda was forced to resign and left office in disgrace. She died in 1978 with cancer, unhappy and feeling misunderstood. So, from my perspective, what was so hard about writing the life of Golda Meir? For me, the rule of writing a biography is avoid hagiography, by which I mean to say the aggrandization or idealization of the subject. A good example of a Golda hagiography is Marie Sirkin, I hope she forgives me, whose biography of Golda is innocent of any critical comment, or the book by Marie and Israel Schenker, As Good as Golda, the title already tells you everything, a popular book from the 1970s describing itself as bringing to readers the warmth and wisdom of Israel's prime minister. So these are good examples of hagiographical work. Sorry, I lost my... A related angle that made the writing of Golda's life hard was the lack of access to her inner life. Golda did not write. In correspondence, her friends always complained of her failure to answer letters. We do have a few letters that Golda wrote to her lover, David Remez, but that is all. No diary, no explanations. One of the major hardships in Golda's experience as a woman was the family career tension that every working woman knows all too well. Every working woman faces the tension between the demands of the job and the demands of child raising. Golda was a gifted speaker, and her bosses wanted to send her to America to raise money necessary for state building. She understood well the urgency of this task and complied. She left her children at home, cared for by her sister Shana, her mother, Bluma, their father, and hired help. The children felt deprived and miserable. They missed their mother. At one point, when Golda was in the United States, a cable arrived from Maurice stating that Sarah, their 8-year-old daughter, was critically ill in the hospital. Many years later, in an interview, Golda's daughter said she could not understand her mother. Quote, "I should have never left a sick child," she said. And here is another dilemma we must confront. Should we condemn Golda or try to empathize? We can talk about it later. Golda refused to sacrifice her career, stay at home and take a less visible role or a less demanding job. I leave it to you to decide this matter and take a stand. In addition to these difficulties, Golda had to tolerate the many disparaging remarks she was hearing from left and right. She was criticized for her toughness. She was criticized for her stubbornness, for her accent, for her heavy homely shoes, and for her limited vocabulary. The most hurtful was the popular statement, a tribute to Ben-Gurion, that Golda was the only man in the cabinet. Many Israelis liked this statement, and repeated it ad nauseam. They found it funny. Perhaps they felt that it fit the patriarchal stereotypes that only men had the stuff from which leaders are made. And that there was something bizarre, not normal, to behave as a man would do, for a woman to behave as a man would do. We shall never know. We shall never know if Ben-Gurion wished to insult other cabinet ministers by implying that they were too feminine, sissies, or whether it meant to insult Golda as one who fell short of the stereotype of a woman. We do know, however, that Golda hated it and found it offensive. By the time I decided to write this biography, Golda was dead. I could not interview her. Her son Menachem, an accomplished cellist, and her daughter Sarah, a kibbutznik, had also passed away. The grandchildren were there, Gideon, known as Gidi, son of Menachem, and Lucky's father, a musician, and Shaul, son of her daughter Sarah, who was born in the kibbutz, and like Golda, developed an expertise in foreign relations. All of this, the lack of information, the need not to write a hagiography, and more, all of this explain why writing Golda's biography was hard. But there was more. A view one can generally trust is that of Yitzhak Rabin. Rabin, the quintessential Sabra, in whose memory this lecture is given, summarized Golda in the following paragraph. Golda's personality, I quote, was a blend of earthiness, Jewish pride, common sense, and iron firmness. This is a useful description until you take it apart, which I'm not going to do here, but it's useful. It's a useful description because Rabin was known as a straight shooter who only said what he believed, was true. He was no sycophant. Let me divert and often a few words about Golda and Rabin. In 1968, Golda, already prime minister, chose Rabin as Israel's ambassador to the United States. In the realm of Israeli foreign affairs, there is no more important and consequential position. Golda had known Rabin for decades, as she was an acquaintance of his mother, Rosa Rabin. Both women had worked in Solel Boneh, Israel's giant construction company since the beginning of the 20s. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol was a great admirer of Rabin, and in general, Golda tended to accept his judgments. Rabin and Golda developed a close and trusting relationship, and Golda mentored Rabin as he came to Washington and nurtured his relationship with the Nixon administration. On October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the day that for Israelis live in infamy, Israel experienced a devastating simultaneous attack on its borders. Both Syria and Egypt invaded Israel at one and the same time. Israel was not ready. It became clear very quickly that there was a serious failure by the intelligence services. They did not detect the upcoming attack. Also, the military was not prepared. Israelis were told to expect quiet on all fronts. We never had it so good, Golda repeatedly said. Israelis were told time and again that in the unlikely event that the Arabs decided to attack it, they will be crushed rapidly and decisively. As the Agranat Commission appointed to investigate these events concluded, hubris and arrogance dominated the land. Golda took a secret in the midst of this crisis. Golda took a secret emergency flight to Washington, D.C. to plead with President Nixon to replenish the considerable armaments Israel was losing: phantom jets, tanks, ammunition, and more. One shudders at the thought of what could have happened had the United States failed to offer Israel the necessary aid. Here, one sees the fruit of Golda's immense experience in foreign affairs, the close relationship she had cultivated for years with the American administration, Congress, the press, and the American people, and her well-known persuasive skills. Without these, it may well be that the airlift, the miraculous airlift as she used to call it, would not have happened and would have taken longer to happen, or would have taken longer to happen. A slow or less substantial airlift would have meant defeat for the Israeli forces in the Sinai. The trauma suffered by Israelis was enormous. 2,800 Israelis were killed. Israeli soldiers were dead. Close to 6,000, close to 6,000 were wounded. Many felt that the likelihood of defeat was genuine and real. The justifiable anger that erupted after the war was targeted at the leadership, primarily at Golda and Moshe Dayan, her Minister of Defense. Public pressure forced her to resign her office. To these days, people blame her poor leadership as the primary factor that led to that war. Had she been less stubborn, less narrow-minded, less convinced that we are invincible, more willing to trade territory for peace, which Sadat had offered, some of the disaster could have been averted. This brings me to one of the hardest issues I had to deal with, the question of Golda's leadership. When I speak to people about these matters, I point out that Israeli public opinion was not so willing to compromise and give up territory. Israelis wanted peace on their own terms, not on the terms acceptable to Anwar el-Sadat, Egypt's president. Evaluating Golda's performance before and during the Yom Kippur War was one of the hardest tasks I have ever faced. Golda's leadership, her will to follow public opinion was well known. Golda knew that the majority of Israelis wanted to keep the territories, and she went along. By comparison, Rabin knew that as well. And when he moved towards a compromise, he was assassinated, paid with his life. We need to think about that. We are still caught in this conundrum. Even the right-wing policy of the Netanyahu government is said to be rooted in the commitment to boost the settler movement and avoid the ending of the occupation. Should Golda have acted differently? These are the hard questions I had to struggle with. I believe that underneath Golda's statement that the life of the woman is hard, 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 also lie these difficulties. Another reason why it is so hard was Golda's concept of leadership. Who is the good leader? One who sees right from wrong, leads the public to embrace the right solution and risk public disapproval, public unrest, and even assassination, or the one who acquiesces with the will of the majority. And bear in mind that the majority is the one that put her in office. Did she have the right to stray from their clear will and preference? Remember too that throughout her service as prime minister, the 70-year-old Golda was sick with cancer. She had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and undergoing chemotherapy. It is possible that she did not feel she had the energy to plunge into a fight and that she was hoping to leave the difficult issues to her successor. We shall never know, but the hypothesis is not entirely unrealistic. It is quite possible that she personally was not in a position to start daring new moves. Let me also tell you about some of the other things that I discovered as I was working on Golda. First, the issue of corruption. We all know that corruption is one of the major problems every constitutional regime has to confront. Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. One major reason why Prime Minister Netanyahu is presently promoting an overhaul of Israel's constitutional system is his hope to avoid his trial for corruption and avoid a jail sentence, which would follow. As a powerful party boss, as a cabinet minister, and as a prime minister, Golda had access to immense assets and could act in corrupt ways to enrich herself and her children. But when you examine Golda's history, you see that she was a modest woman, humble, who refused to take advantage of the temptations of office. There are many letters in the state archives attesting to this proposition. The wave of grief and compassion that swept the world when Golda's death was announced is testimony to her place in history. She wanted to be somebody, and she was. Today, her name is known to any well-educated person, man or woman in the United States and elsewhere. She had achievements, most significantly, Israel's labor codification and the strong bond she forged between Israel and the United States. She had failures too, most notably on the road to the Yom Kippur War. At the same time, she was a full woman, had children whom she loved and who loved her in return, even if she neglected them in pursuit of her career. And she had, it appears, a rich and fulfilling love life with several men. And you can ask me afterwards and I can tell you a little bit about it. All of this is quite impressive and remarkable. Freud is known to have said that life is about liberty, Liebe und Arbeite, love and work. Well, she did both. She loved and she worked, and that's what she wanted to do. We have every reason to be proud of her, despite her failures and shortcomings. Israeli public opinion, once decisively negative about Golda, is now ready to consider her through a more thoughtful and nuanced lens. What is the lesson? So that, for example, we have now in Israel an ice cream chain called Glida Golda, which is quite successful and prosperous. So, you know, the name Golda is no longer negative. People go, they want this ice cream. They like this ice cream. They think it's a good idea. It's tasty. So what you can see is things are changing. The Israeli perception is changing. And that, I think, is a good sign that, meaning that Israelis are willing to reconsider. They look back and they say, yes, this is not as bad as we were told or we felt it was. Let's not underestimate this moment. Israeli public opinion, once decisively negative about Golda, is now ready to reconsider it, excuse me for repeating, through a more thoughtful and nuanced lens. What is the lesson we can draw about Golda and Israeli society? What is the role of misogyny in the current state of affairs, where, for example, the Israeli cabinet has less than 16% women, okay, members in the cabinet, less than 16%, the Israeli cabinet right now, okay, very few women in parliament as well, in the Knesset. What do we make out of this? Why is it that Netanyahu does not appoint more women? Do we miss, do we have a lack in very successful women, in accomplished women? Or is this misogyny still working? You know, it's, you know, free time, you know, to accomplish exactly the same thing that was there for years and years. We also have to ask, what role did Golda play in the public memory of misogyny? And what could have been attributed to this state of affairs? These are very important questions that we need to consider. We also need to ask, what does leadership mean? And do we really fault her for following public opinion rather than for following, let's say, Rabin's path? These are important questions for us to reflect upon as we continue to think about gender equality, Israeli history, and Israeli politics. Thank you. So if you are ready, I'm willing to tell you, I see that it was relatively short, the talk. I can tell you, yeah.
I think, yes.
Yeah. So, Professor, okay, I'm sorry.
Shall I?
Please.
Yes. Should come.
Which places?
What we do. Yes.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Before I start, I would like to thank the Elie Wiesel Center for inviting me. And it is a sheer pleasure to be here and discuss Professor Lahav's book as a one biographer to another. So let me just bring forth my yes, and without further ado, okay. Is it okay, please? I will put the pages in, okay. It's okay? In the winter of 1922, the disillusioned and fatigued Ada Fishman, a relentless activist, founder and leader of the women workers movement, and a member of Hapoel Hatzair's leadership, discovered a ray of hope. She finally traced a promising young accomplice she considered capable of partaking alongside her in organizing the women workers, harnessing her energy and talent to a gender-based, non-partisan labor alliance. The new face, or hand rather, in Ada Fishman's dwindling stack of women activists was Golda Meir. The focus of Professor Lahav's ever so needed gender analysis of Golda Meir. In The Only Woman in the Room, published a century later, Lahav reminds her readers who her protagonist was. The second woman in the world to serve as a Minister of Foreign Affairs and the third as Prime Minister. Nevertheless, little is known about the process and personas involved in alluring Golda into working on a women's political platform at the dawn of her career. As it happened, this was a stepping stone for both Golda and her patrons in the labor milieu, who attempted to control the uncharted terrain of the working women's organization. Indeed, Golda's brief encounter with women's politics did not escape Lahav's attention. How should we understand Golda's later decision to distance herself from feminism? Lahav ponders in her introduction. The schism between Golda's awareness of her alterity as a woman in a men's world and her non-apologizing denial of feminism is unveiled in Lahav's biography. In the following, I intend to investigate Lahav's examination further and offer a complementary explanation. Suffice to say that Golda and Hodel, who in her early teens would change her name to Ada, founding mothers of the Zionist Yishuv, movers and shakers. Let me see if it works here, just a minute. Yes, this is the stamp, by the way, that was recently published. Yeah, indeed, toda. Suffice to say that Golda and Hodel, founding mothers of the Zionist Yishuv, movers and shakers of labor Zionism, could have been loyal friends and comrades endeavoring for a shared cause. Both were born in Imperial Russia at the end of the 19th century to traditional Jewish families, economically challenged fathers, and struggling to make ends meet mothers. Both were no strangers to the pogroms that plagued Russian Jewry at the turn of the 20th century, though they had been influenced differently by these. Both experienced the Jewish fate and feebleness vis-a-vis these pogroms, and both were meant to become chaste wives and mothers, the typical Eshet Chayil, a woman of valor. And yet, both were growing up in a changing world. For one, education for girls became more accessible. Zionism, social movements dismantled the shtetl walls and swept the Jewish youth, men and women alike. Also, both accumulated political experience in the Zionist movement before immigrating to Eretz Israel and made their debut in the local labor Zionist arena shortly afterwards. As a result, neither Golda nor Hodel followed the expectations and path designed for them by their parents. Akin to Ada Fishman, Golda, too, immigrated to Eretz Israel in her 20s. But unlike Fishman, she was a newly arrived immigrant from the United States, whose reputation as a zealous Poalei Zion member preceded her. The two had in common not only several aspects of their biographies, but also some character qualities such as perseverance and resolve, ideological determination, and labor affiliation and creed, and the experience of working together in the Women Workers' Council, the elected apparatus of Histadrut women. And along their long political career, both women were denied the acknowledgement of the Haredi leaders of their leadership. Instead, they were subject to their scrutiny and discontent with the high rank they ascended to. If so, was the clash between the two activists inevitable? Golda and Ada differed regarding their worldviews, personal and professional choices, and how their colleagues saw them. Fishman grew up in the fat-rich meadows of Bessarabia, surrounded by Jews, as a daughter of a learned, distinguished scribe whom she revered, and a determined woman of initiative who died when she was in her teens. Her father encouraged his children, irrespective of sex, to get an education and supported their incipient Zionism. Golda Meir's background, on the other hand, was quite different. Her childhood home was intellectually impoverished, and whatever she wanted to know, she had to learn by herself. Unlike Fishman, who with a fluency in literacy in Hebrew committed her ideas to writing, Mason, who was always haunted by her deficient education, as Lahav explicates, largely refrained from putting pen to paper. It was in America, where Golda arrived in 1906 at the age of 8, where a gate to a new life was opened before her. Like Ada, Golda began her Zionist activity at an early age. Joining the Poale Zion party, she devoted her energies to organizational and party activities. At 20, after she had made up her mind to leave Milwaukee for Eretz Israel, she got married in a modest religious ceremony. From then on, her life would be caught in a web of opposing commitments to her spouse and family on the one hand, and to her public activities on the other. Did the ardent single woman Fishman's understanding of this inbuilt conflict for politically active women lead her never to marry? In 1921, the young Mason couple arrived in Eretz Israel, the American frontier, as Lahav's eloquent depiction of British-ruled Palestine suggests. A few months later, the couple fulfilled Golda's wish to live in a kibbutz. Merchavia, where they already knew a friend from the US, was a natural choice. In Merchavia, Golda took exception to the aesthetic ideology that had taken hold among the more veteran women and saw unnecessary parsimony in their frugality and rough lifestyle. In her autobiography, My Life, Golda offers a revealing description of a parting between a young man and a kibbutz member whose appearance had been affected by the scorching sun and the harsh regime of physical work. When she held her hand out to shake his, he said, "In America, it was a pleasure to hold your hand. Now it is an honor." Seeing how the young pioneer was affected by this noble statement, Golda remarked, "To me, this was nonsense." Golda, as Lahav asserts, was attentive to her appearance and did not shy away from manifesting it. Living the good life under any circumstances could be seen in the Mason's record player, which presided over the room in the kibbutz, in Golda's ironed and well-maintained clothes, her attention to the food served to the comrades in the communal kitchen, in short, in her middle-class values. All of this contributed nothing to the relations between the Spartan Fishman and Mason. Years later, Golda would send a barb in Ada's direction that shows something of the gap between their different lifestyles. Can any of you tell me how many of the readers of Ada's book will also take up her ideas and her lifestyle? She remarked. Yet, despite their stellar achievements, neither Golda nor Ada escaped being ridiculed for their appearance, attire, and way of speaking by men and also women. Thus, Golda's entrance, or rather her sliding into the country's fledgling labor movement, was a natural continuation of her activities in the Poale Zion party in the US. Whereas for Ada, her senior counterpart, it was not. Ada Fishman, an observant, unwedded woman of 20 years old, immigrated to Eretz Israel in the wake of 1913. Akin to women literates everywhere, Fishman started her prolific career as a school teacher, first in Petah Tikva and later in Zefad, which became the arena for her Eretz Israeli political debut. Fishman chose the Bar Yochai men's only celebration in Lag BaOmer to manifest her views. Women should not be treated disputatively because of their biological traits. The young activist who observed Jewish mitzvot defied the dictates of the rabbinical establishment and decided to participate in the festivities. In so doing, Fishman practically redefined the political arena dominated by Orthodox men, ensuring that women, religious or not, would be included. In the interwar years, she immersed herself in every struggle on every front for women's rights. Fishman's involvement in the struggle to initiate the women workers' movement in 1920 and for women's political rights, which ended only in 1926, proved her fierce loyalty to social justice and deprived women. During her struggle for women's suffrage, Fishman demonstrated her staunch belief in women's non-partisan collaboration. One time, Aharonovich, one of the Histadrut's leaders, approached me inquiring, "Till when will you collaborate with these Zionist bourgeois ladies, Ada Remenist?" Without hesitation, she slashed back. "As long as the gates of the Yeshuv's elected body, Asifat HaNefcharim, will be wide open before you and sealed before me, I shall go with the deprived women." Ill it is, Aharonovich acceded that the women's war is indeed human and just. Assisting women workers was pivotal, no less. Fishman's attention was commanded by unequal pay, dire working conditions, and poorly organized institutions that were too feeble to compete in a tough labor market. Thus, almost single-handedly, she was the sentinel for the interest of women workers. Foremost was the question of partisan politics or non-partisanship within the women workers movement. The approach spearheaded by Fishman strove to expand the authority of the women's apparatus. The opposite approach, however, espoused by the women belonging to Achdut HaAvoda, Golda Meir, one of them, called for prioritizing the Histadrut establishment while subordinating all the other workers' apparati, including that of the women, to its authority. This dilemma unveiled a bitter rivalry between comrades. Fishman fought vigorously and refused to succumb. Her independence put her at odds with the political powers in the Histadrut and the women workers' apparatus. In contrast, her younger counterpart, and at that time also protege, Golda Meir, paved her way to the top of the Histadrut apparatus step by step, fulfilling one task after another, supported by key figures in her party. Golda was elected to the Committee of Merchavia and chosen as a delegate to the 1922 Kibbutz Movement Convention, where she met the people who would become the leaders of the labor movement and her patrons. Chief among them, David Remez. But another assignment that same year, her selection as a delegate to the Second Women Workers Convention, foreshadowed her political path in the following years. Interestingly, of all the appointments she would later recall, this last one remained unmentioned in Meir's autobiography. Even so, it was not a foregone conclusion that Ada and Golda would clash. Despite their different party affiliations, Fishman saw Meir as a potential comrade in the struggle to improve the status of women laborers. Moreover, at the beginning of the 1920s, Meir looked fit and capable of joining that struggle. In 1922, Golda participated in a discussion in the Women Workers' Council in which she proposed, as an American, to try fundraise in America for women's farms. The latter was a worthy cause in Fishman's eyes as well. Meyerson's proposal was well received, and a few days later, Fishman recommended that Golda be included in the list of women candidates to participate in the second Histadrut convention. Fishman also planned for Meyerson to take on one of the two most vital channels of operation for the women workers movement. For this purpose, Fishman hoped that Meyerson would undertake to move from Merchavia to Haifa. Much to Ada's chagrin, however, that particular period was one of personal hardship for Golda. She was fighting a different war, trying to salvage her marriage. As a result, she did not accede to Fishman's repeated pleas to become more active. Did Fishman know what was going on in Meyerson's personal life? Having chosen not to marry, was she insensitive towards the problematic situation of a married comrade and her struggle to preserve her family? As in every other area of Fishman's life, she sacrificed her personal needs for the greater good and expected her colleagues to follow suit. Hence, it was not long before Ada and Golda collided. Their partisan division reached its zenith in 1928, when Meyerson accepted the proposal of David Remez, her intimate friend, that she return to work and become the secretary of the Women Workers' Council. Remez's choice of Golda was hardly accidental. Using Meyerson's appointment, the members of the labor establishment hoped to weaken the biting opposition organized and presided over by Ada Fishman. Yet, despite the patronage of the Histadrut establishment, Meyerson did not cope successfully with holding a top position in the women workers' movement. Golda's serving on the secretariat was her first practical grappling with a role demanding performance in the women's apparatus. During the year and a half that she was a member of the council's secretariat, she spent long periods on missions to the US on behalf of her party and the Histadrut. Her frequent expeditions were confronted with massive antagonism on the part of Fishman. Fishman protested against Ben-Gurion's blatant favoritism, which cleared the way for Golda's partisan mission while still serving in the women workers' apparatus. Consequently, Ada's aspirations to collaborate with Golda were short-lived, partly due to a clash of personalities and partly due to a conflict of priorities and conflicting outlook on policies, especially women's. Where Fishman emphasized the importance of an independent organization for women, Meyerson maintained that this should be obsolete. Where Fishman put feminist issues before her partisan loyalty, Meyerson stayed within her party lines. Finally, in January 1930, Meyerson, a worked-out mother and wife who saw her marriage collapse, tendered her resignation. Golda was resolute not to withdraw from the general political arena, but was ready to part ways with women's politics. Indeed, as Golda's frequent trips show, the American arena, both Jewish and non-Jewish, was her strong suit. Raised and educated in the Midwest, Goldie possessed many traits and knew how to approach the fellow patriots she met on her many excursions. She had the manners, language, and sense of local culture and traditions. It is a small wonder, therefore, that she was adored and loved by them. This was one of her most precious assets, which she employed in her long political career and which many a comrade in the labor movement could only dream of having. One of them was Ada Fishman herself. Ada's mission to the US in 1951 on behalf of the Women Workers' Council showcases these formidable women's differences. Although her reputation as a staunch parliamentarian preceded her, Ada was never loved or admired by the women and men she met in the US. Goldie was one of them, whereas Ada was an outsider. Ada took the time to learn English, but was never fluent and barely spoke the language in public. Having a family who immigrated to the United States, she witnessed their desperate struggle to persevere. Their plight contributed to her disdain for the American way of life, which she rejected as an exemplary model for the young state of Israel to emulate. Where Goldie was an American, Ada remained an Eastern European Jewish woman with somewhat awkward social graces and limited life experience in liberal Western cultures. Thus, coming to the end of my brief talk, Ada Fishman regarded herself first and foremost as a women's leader who advocated for their concerns and interests in every channel. She did not waver, even at the expense of her own advancement. Fishman's feminist agenda, political affiliation, vigorous independence, as well as her austere personality, determined her political path and also resulted in the fact that her prolific activity was, till recently, obscured in the Israeli collective memory. On the other hand, Golda became the quintessentially liberated, successful Israeli woman who broke the glass ceiling and defied men's subordination. However, the Yom Kippur War, as Professor Lahav mentioned earlier, marked both leaders' decline. Ada Maimon quietly passed away, whereas heartbroken Golda would leave office. Golda's myopia to foresee what was coming sentenced her to harsh public scrutiny. Bear with me for a minute because I would like to show you this. It was published 3 weeks ago in Haaretz. For those of you who cannot read Hebrew, Golda here is being compared to Bibi Netanyahu, and both are marked as ill-doers for Israel. So, Golda's behavior during the war marred her reputation and shadowed her years-long service as a Zionist activist and emissary on behalf of her party and leaders, as the Minister of Labor, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and as the Prime Minister. And yet, despite the criticism, mockery, and discontent of political rivals and ordinary citizens alike, Golda's position in the Jewish and Israeli collective memory was not hindered. On the contrary, Golda Meir remained the iconic female figure of modern Jewish history. After all, Golda's personality, influential friends and position, and not the introverted, fiercely outspoken and modest spinster that embodied Ada Maimon, provided ample materials for myth to form. And I would like to show you these are SodaStream bottles. There was a line a few Yom Ha'atzmaut ago, like 3 or 4 years ago, Golda, Herzl, and Ben-Gurion. Pillars of Zionism in Israel. Thank you very much.
Talk now? Can you hear me? Microphone.
מצוין. תודה רבה.
Hear me well? Okay, I'll be very brief. I want to open the floor for questions, but I have 2 short comments, if I may. One, as Professor Lahav mentioned, I read the manuscript of the book. It was really, really interesting. And after I finished reading it, I realized that there are many similarities between Professor Lahav and Prime Minister Golda Meir. Like career, but with Professor Lahav, with the family, feminist perspective, moving from different countries. Golda made Aliyah to Palestine. Professor Lahav made Aliyah to the US. But in other, I have a whole list here. Leaders in the communities. Professor Lahav is a pioneer scholar in the field of Israel studies, and she established the subfield of history of law in Israel studies. So she's the leader, she's the godmother of this subfield. And but maybe most interestingly, when you talk about Prime Minister Meir or Professor Lahav, you use her first names. Like, so you say Golda, you said Golda, but in the field of Israel studies, when you say Pnina, we know that it's Professor Lahav. So this is one thing. And as I said, I read the book, and like my students, I've been teaching here for a few years now, a course on Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of my students are here, Alison, hi. And I read Pnina's book, and she really tried to convince me to change my negative image of Golda Meir. And like my students, I give them a lot of information, but in the end, when I read the final papers, they go back to their preconceived emotions about it. So I just want to mention that Golda, in my perspective, was not passive. She actively blocked agreement with Egypt. She actively blocked integration of Mizrahi Jews in Israel. She denied the existence of Palestinian people. She didn't include Haredim and others, Arab citizens of Israel, in Israeli society. And when the war ended, the floodgates were forcefully opened, and they're still open. So maybe if there's not only Glida Golda, but Falafel Golda, then I change my mind. Thank you. So how I do it, questions from here, or so let's take a moment. Yes, can you introduce yourself? And no.
Professor Lahav mentioned the Yom Kippur issue with Golda Meir. But there is another issue that you started to touch a little, and which is a problem to these days. She always said, when they ask about the Palestinians, she said there's no Palestinian nation. There's no Palestinian, it doesn't exist. And it's very funny because she was from the Labor Party, and today the settlers and the extreme right actually keep this idea. So it's ironic, you know, and Rabin was actually assassinated because he wanted to get a little away from this approach, and he paid his life. So I don't know if it's in the book, I didn't read your book, but I think it's a big stain on Golda Meir, and I think in part of it is because she came from outside. She wasn't born in Israel. She didn't know the mentality. She didn't speak Arabic. She didn't know Palestinian. And I think it's more like an arrogant attitude, you know, toward the other people who live in the same land. And I didn't hear anybody here tonight talking about it. I mean, the only a little hint was from this gentleman.
Pnina, can you answer?
You want me to answer? Well, I agree with your description of what I said or what Golda was. You know, Golda was, first of all, we have to historicize it. She was speaking in the 1970s, where the struggle between the Palestinians and the Israelis revolved around, among other things, the question of whether the Palestinians are a national entity or not. That was the mirror image of the Palestinians claiming that the Jews were just a religion and not a people. So the Israelis, we Jews said the Palestinians are not a people, and the Palestinians would say the Jews are not a people. That's the way it went, and she went along with it. What you are saying, if you accept my analysis, then the way that we should say it is Golda was not critical. She was not critical about that matter, and therefore she came with a sometimes very stupid arguments that I am a Palestinian also because I have a Palestinian passport. Okay, so some Israelis were happy about it, some Israelis did not think about it. Yes, and she just went along and she got away with it. That's all, because the Israelis at the time were not willing to think, and so about these matters. And so my view is this: if you accept this position, then what you should attribute it to failure of leadership in the area of public education. Okay, it was not simple for an Israeli leader in the 1970s to say, yes, the Palestinian people are an entity and are entitled to exactly what we have. It was not simple. Okay, and the question is, so you're saying, why didn't she do it? Well, it's leadership, but it's not only leadership. There is politics involved, right? And yeah, there is politics involved. So you have to decide which way you're going to go and how you are going to go it. Okay, and there was a time where she did say that the Palestinians are a people and are entitled. The big question between the Palestinians and the Israelis about the right of return, yes, about two-state solutions, this she did not touch. And the reason she did not touch it, and now you should look at maybe not yourself, but at your friends, one of the reasons she did not touch it, which is what I try to raise, the Israelis were supporting her. Said to her, yes, we like this, okay? We are not going to return the territories. We don't have anything to do with the Palestinians, and we are going to continue. Why? Because we are strong and we can do it. So now, do we blame our fellow Israelis also, or do we only blame, Golda and a small cadre of leadership? That's the question. I always try to ask Israelis, where were you in 1967, in the Yom Kippur War? Where were you? Were you in favor of compromises? And every Israeli will tell you, no, there is no reason to compromise. So how do you do it when the Israeli public doesn't want to do it? That's the question. That's the question. I'm not saying it's simple. I don't want to say it's simple. But what I'm saying is to blame one leader, okay, is a little bit of a mistake.
Okay. Do we have other questions? If you can introduce yourself, please.
My name is Steve Bookbinder. Tell us more about Golda's relationship to the Mizrahi, population, to their immigration, and your own personal views in that regard.
Okay, so thank you. So this is, I'm not going to give a long lecture here because there are other people, I'm sure, who would like to jump in. There is this argument that Golda was decisively against Mizrahim, and I think that I heard it from Nahum also. I tend to disagree with that. Golda did not help much, meaning Golda did not design a policy that would take the Mizrahim out of their poverty and bring them onto the path of integration. That could be true, okay? But there are some things to remember. First of all, if you look at Golda's life, her son-in-law, the husband of her daughter, Sarah, was a Yemenite Jew. If you look at him, just look at him, he was dark. He was as dark as just Thomas, just to give you an example, okay, to bring it home, okay? He was very dark. Now, for an Israeli Ashkenazi of Golda's stature and social rank, okay, to accept into the husband of her precious and only man, I will say it again because it helps, but it brings it home. Justice Thomas was not simple. Okay? It's one thing for Justice Thomas to marry Ginny Thomas in the beginning of the 21st century. It was definitely another thing in the 50s for a member of the Labour Party, top Labour Party, to marry somebody who was a Yemenite. It was just another thing. I can because I'm one of them, okay? And I know how they accepted, and I know how they were criticized. So now the fact that Golda accepted him, okay, wholeheartedly, and appeared in public, and took photos, and took him to Moscow, and showed him off, okay, as her son-in-law, and be proud of him, I think that's a big deal. That was educational. If you want to talk about education, that was a message to the Israeli people. Look, guys, we are integrating. Take it to heart and do likewise. So that's one thing. The other thing I want to say very briefly is, which is a matter for historians to really take a look at, is the issue of this incident where Golda said about the Moroccan Jews that they are not nechmadim, they are not nice. Okay, so the Moroccan Jews were rising up in arms, okay, or protesting violently against Golda's government, probably rightly so, yes? And at a certain point in time, as they were protesting, Molotov cocktails were thrown out into the crowd, okay? Or one Molotov cocktail. It was a moment of crisis. And one of the Moroccan leaders came to Golda and said to her, you know, Golda, I met them, the Moroccans group, and actually they are nice guys. And at the moment, as this was happening, and Golda says, no, they are not nice guys. They're lo nechmadim, okay? And this is in the protocol. She said it, okay? Let's not take it out of context. She said it as a response to the argument about the Molotov cocktails. They are throwing Molotov cocktails. She says, people who throw Molotov cocktails are not nice, okay? I personally think I would say the same thing, okay? So was she decisively against Mizrahi Jews? Was she trying to suppress them? I don't think so. I think she believed, maybe naively, in integration. She believes that by and large, which is, she also believed about women's rights, meaning we don't have to do too much. With time, it will develop in the right direction. That's what she believed. Maybe this was a big mistake, but that's what she thought might happen.
More questions? Comments?
Thank you, Professor. My question is about your comments on her following the public opinion, particularly with respect to the 1973 war. Did you find that her style of leadership with respect to public opinion changed over the course of her career? So, for example, when she was Minister of Labor and she was shepherding through that social legislation that you talked about, was she following? Was she leading? Was she helping to shape? But more, the bigger question is, did you see a change in her attitude towards the public opinion through the course of her career?
I think it's a great question. Thank you, Sarah. Sarah was one of my very first students in my career as a law professor, and she's a brilliant woman on her own rights. So thank you, Sarah, for coming. She, in the 50s, when she was developing the labor codification, she was very active. She was very active, and her aim was to pass legislation that would fit the best examples of the International Labor Organization in Europe. That's what she aimed to do, and she said it many times. And this law is like the law that's the International Labor Organization, and she was very active. And for example, without her and her stamina and her stubbornness, we would not have had a Social Security Act. No, because the Minister of Treasury was against it. He said it's irresponsible. We can't afford it. Okay. And she worked with Ben-Gurion and others, and she basically forced it through. The same thing with maternity leave, okay? So if in the United States, you don't have maternity leave still, and in Israel, you do have maternity leave, that is, among other things, I don't want to say only, is because Golda was willing to put her body on the line. And she did, and she managed to do it. So I think this actually shows leadership. Now, it may well be that it's, as time went by, she got tired. You know, she was happy with what she did. She was already sick with cancer. And she said, now let other people do it. I can't do everything. I think that's what happened. That is, she was not as vigorous and energetic as she became prime minister. Okay, and she had other problems, other troubles, and this was less, on the took a lower part in her, in her preferences. And she said, my work in the Ministry of Labor was the best time in my life because she felt that she accomplished something very important. And I also want to say thank you to the state of Wisconsin that actually drilled labor laws and labor rights in Golda as a young student. So that's, I always like to see the relationship between the from and what you're trying to do. I think here is it's quite clear. So, but she was also a compromiser. She was a practical person. She was not an ideologue. So, and her mantra always was, the best is the enemy of the good, which she learned from her Lavel, David Remes. The best is the enemy of the good. Okay, so let's get the good and not aspire to the best. You can criticize her. You have so much power. Why don't you aim at more? And she should have done it, but she didn't.
Can you please also introduce yourself, because that will be.
No, this has to be the last question.
Okay, last two questions.
Hi, Pnina. Doug Starr here. Can you comment on Golda's special relationship and persuasiveness with the United States and how that's compared to other prime ministers?
If I can comment or Nachum can comment.
No, you. I can comment on other things.
She had a very good relationship with the United States. She had a very close relationship with Nixon, which also had to do, we are not going to go into it, but they had to do with defense issues of the United States, okay, that she was accommodating and, going forward with. And so her relationship with Nixon was very strong. I don't want to say intimate, but they trusted each other and they worked together hand in hand, okay? And Rabin facilitated it. Rabin facilitated it as her ambassador. So now Nixon also gave her Israel a lot of things, So for example, this what I alluded to, the airlift that Israel needs desperately. I hope Nachum agrees with it. During the Yom Kippur War, that would not have happened without Golda. She took a plane to the United States in the midst of the battle, okay? In the midst of the fight, she went there overnight to speak to Nixon and to pledge with him and plead with him to give Israel the arms that it needed. And I think that if not for the good relationship that she had carved with Nixon earlier, and Nixon realized that he also has the support of the Congress and the press, it would not have happened. It would not have happened. And if it did not happen, which some say that's what Kissinger wanted, okay, that Israel would not get the arms, okay, and Israel will be a little bit humbled, yes, lose a few fights here and there, and and therefore lose some of its hubris. That was the plan. And actually, I just read in the Israeli papers that the chief of intelligence now is predicting exactly the same thing. That if Israel faces a need, okay, what the United States might do, based as always on past experience, is halt the aid and let Israel bleed a little bit. So, it did not happen because of Golda. I don't want to say only because of Golda, but I think that her persuasive skill first and her good relations with the United States leadership helped.
Okay.
Excuse me?
We don't have much time.
Well, this
So-
prime minister that we have now is now out of grace with the United States government. So they may, I don't know what they are going to decide to do. Okay. She was always careful, actually, from the time that she was fundraising before she became Minister of Labor. Okay. Always careful to maintain a very strong relationship with the United States. And she always emphasized also in the cabinet that the United States is the only a friend that we should rely on, okay? Whereas the Israelis were looking elsewhere also. And don't forget, 56 is the time of the great camaraderie and brotherhood with France, okay? So it was not easy for her to persuade people to go there.
We'll take the last question, okay?
Please do.
Okay, so Professor Gilman, known as Abby.
Quick question. What can feminists learn from Golda? You might have different answers. And I think that this portrait of two Israeli women of the same generation who took different stances, different priorities, is very instructive. And we still see these issues facing women in power and feminists and the choices we make and who to lead and how to compromise. So what do you all think that feminists, that we can learn from Golda?
First of all, what she did. If you listen to what she said, it was not too much and not too, encouraging, right? She stayed away from the issue. And so she was always, maybe she was scared of men. Maybe she did not want a backlash. I don't know exactly how to explain. There are lots of explanations here. But she was not a full-fledged feminist in her speech. In her action, yes. That's the thing. So my advice to Israelis is look at what she did. Don't ask what she said. She said things that she was just afraid, because she was afraid of a backlash. I don't justify her, but I'm saying look also at what she did. What she did is she chose her work even on the, even at the expense of her children. She said, I want to work. Yes. And I need to work and I am going to work. And I'm going to make sure that the children will be okay, but I'm not going to sacrifice. That's, I think, is an important point. The other thing that is an important point is she was a role model. She was a role model to a lot of women. Okay, we have one sitting here in the audience, who is a professor of mathematics, who told me several times that Golda was a role model for her also. She was a role model. And I asked myself, I did not really realize it when I was, 6, 7 years old, and she was Minister of Labor. But just hearing on the radio a woman speaking, and she is the Minister of Labor, and she makes decisions. When you hear her, okay, rather than all of these men, it makes a difference. And what you say to yourself as a young girl, 6, 7 years old, is it's possible. And therefore, I can do it too, okay? So she served as a role model.
Batsheva?
I concur with Pnina that from her personal perspective, she managed to do a lot. She defied obstacles that other women had to succumb to. Yet on the other hand, I'll say it very cautiously because I'm a guest, she did not do much for women. She did not help women. If we learn from her affair with Shulamit Aloni, for instance, she practically did to other women in politics, in the political arena, what men did to women. So if we want to divide Golda the person who succeeded and presented a very strong and convincing role model for women, from Golda the politician who did not do much for other women, who did not help other women, who did not who did not hold the ladder for other women to climb, then it is a more complex lesson that we learn from Golda. As history is.
I think you also asked me, because I read the book, so I looked at it from a man, marriage life, and her husband really loved her and gave up on his career and took care of the kids. Luckily, I'm also married to a Korean woman, but it's very equal. So, but I, in a paradoxical way, looked at the man perspective. So it's a reverse feminism in many ways. Okay, so I think there's no, if you want to know more about the lovers, so you need to read the book.
Yes. אתה היית בינה.
And I want to thank the center. I want to thank
היה לי שני עמודים, אבל החלטתי לפסוח עליהם.
Israelis.
Yes, sorry.
I'm
Yeah. Oh, she said to me, you were gentle with the issue of the lovers. And I said, I had 2 pages on it, but I decided to skip them. Sorry.
Wisely so. Wisely so.
But I agree with Batsheva. She did not do too much for
I
women.
guess
It's true.
Tom Segev will need to write a book of Golda, so we'll get all the gossip. A movie. I want to thank the center for organizing it.
Yes.
And the important Rabin series lectures. Thank you for helping and providing for that. I want to thank Professor Margalit Stern, Batsheva, for wonderful, interesting talk. And I want to thank Professor Pnina for her wonderful talk.